Ethel Kennedy, matriarch of family political dynasty, dies at 96. Ethel Kennedy, the steadfast matriarch of a dynastic political family whose legacy includes a cascade of triumphs, tragedies, and trials since the assassination of her husband, Robert, a half-century ago, died Thursday, her family said. Mrs. Kennedy, one of the last living links to the Camelot era, was 96. Born into privilege and married into political royalty, Mrs. Kennedy led an often glamorous life. Yet, it was a life seared by excruciating losses, including the deaths of her husband and 2 of her sons. It is with our hearts full of love that we announce the passing of our amazing grandmother, Ethel Kennedy. Her grandson Joseph P. Kennedy III, a former Massachusetts congressman, said in a post Thursday on social media. Along with a lifetime's work in social justice and human rights, our mother leaves behind 9 children, 34 grandchildren, and 24 great-grandchildren, along with numerous nieces and nephews, all of whom love her dearly. It is with our hearts full of love that we announce the passing of our amazing grandmother, Ethel Kennedy. She died this morning from complications related to a stroke suffered last week. Along with a lifetime's work in social justice and human rights, our mother leaves behind Mrs. Kennedy, who had a home in Hyannisport at the family's storied compound, suffered a stroke in her sleep last Thursday. The family did not say where she died. She was a devout Catholic and a daily communicant, and we are comforted in knowing she is reunited with the love of her life, our father, Robert F. Kennedy, her children David and Michael, her daughter-in-law Mary, her grandchildren Maeve and Saoirse, and her great-grandchildren Gideon and Josie. Joseph Kennedy III said. In 1968, Mrs. Kennedy was a mother of 10, with an 11th child on the way, when her husband was assassinated in California moments after winning the state's Democratic presidential primary. She never remarried and largely avoided the public eye thereafter, although she never strayed far from it. In 2012, she was the focus of a documentary film produced by her daughter Rory. Ethel provided a rare glimpse into Mrs. Kennedy's private life, captured in home videos harkening back to her childhood in Greenwich, Connecticut. However, the film skirted, or avoided altogether, many of the more painful episodes in her life, including her husband's death. "Nobody gets a free ride," she said at one point, brushing aside a question about trauma and loss. "Dig in and do what you can, because it might not last." Mrs. Kennedy championed progressive causes such as social justice and human rights. Her work on behalf of the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights, now the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Foundation, a nonprofit organization she founded in 1968, took her all over the world. When she was not traveling, the Kennedy connection kept her bound to Massachusetts. She spent summers at the family compound in Hyannisport, often visited by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. There and elsewhere, she supported various charitable causes, raised money for Democratic candidates, local and national, and played host to a yearly Cape Cod golf tournament that drew VIPs from politics, show business, sports, business, and the media. In 2014, Mrs. Kennedy was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. During a White House ceremony, President Barack Obama, for whom Mrs. Kennedy had campaigned, commented, "To many Americans, Ethel Kennedy is known as a wife, mother, and grandmother. And in many ways it's through these roles she's been able to make her mark on history." Ethel Skakel was born April 11, 1928, in Chicago to business mogul George Skakel and Anne Brannock Skakel. One of 7 children, she mostly grew up in a palatial home in Greenwich. Although Kennedy-like in many regards, wealthy, rambunctious, entitled, sometimes reckless in their behavior, the Skakels were staunch Republicans. Like the Kennedys, too, the Skakels were touched by tragedy. In 1955, Ethel's parents died in a plane crash. Other dark chapters lay ahead. A lifelong athlete, Mrs. Kennedy excelled at horseback riding. She was a champion equestrian, skiing, ice skating, tennis, golf, sailing, and outdoors adventuring. She was famously competitive, too, whether playing doubles with her tennis friends or a family board game in her living room, and possessed what one of her sons characterized as A healthy disregard for authority in all its forms. Ethel Skakel attended Greenwich Academy, Convent of the Sacred Heart, and Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart. She met Robert Kennedy on a 1945 ski trip to Canada, introduced by his sister Jean Kennedy, a college roommate of hers. Bobby Kennedy began seeing Ethel's older sister, Patricia. When they broke up, he and Ethel began dating. The couple married in 1950. Reports placed the number of wedding guests at nearly 2,000, and moved to Virginia, where Robert Kennedy was finishing law school. Their marriage produced 11 children: Kathleen, born in 1951, Joseph, 52, Robert Jr., 54, David, 55, Courtney, 56, Michael, 58, Carrie, 59, Christopher, 63, Maxwell, 65, Douglas, 67, and Rory, 68, born after her father's death. In 1956, the couple moved into Hickory Hill, a family-owned estate in suburban Virginia previously occupied by Jack and Jackie Kennedy. A sprawling Georgian mansion built on 6 acres, with 2 swimming pools, tennis courts, horse paddocks, and a movie theater, it became a mecca for the political, media, intellectual, and show business elite. John Lennon, Judy Garland, Rudolph Nureyev, and André Malraux were among the revelers drawn to the Kennedy parties that became regular fodder for newspaper features and gossip columns. A lifelong prankster, Mrs. Kennedy delighted in the number and prominence of partygoers who got pushed, fully clothed, into her backyard pool. She was known to drive fast and not particularly care if she got ticketed. In one famous piece of Ethel Kennedy lore, she liberated several horses from a neighbor's barn, concerned they were being mistreated, and was arrested for horse thievery, then a capital offense in Virginia. The charges were eventually dropped. Hickory Hill housed its own private menagerie: horses, dogs, turtles, and a sea lion named Sandy. Mrs. Kennedy sold the property in 2009 for $8.5 million. After President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Mrs. Kennedy supported her husband's decision to seek New York's vacant Senate seat in 1964. He won that election, and in 1968 he set his sights on the Democratic Party's nomination for president after Lyndon B. Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. Mrs. Kennedy was campaigning with her husband that June when he was gunned down in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles by Sirhan Sirhan. She knelt by Robert Kennedy's side as he lay mortally wounded on the floor of a hotel pantry, and accompanied him in the ambulance ride to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead hours later. After a funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, she accompanied her husband's body on a train to Washington, D.C. 2 million mourners lined the route to watch the 21-car train pass, occasionally catching glimpses of Mrs. Kennedy and her brother-in-law Ted Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy had numerous opportunities to remarry yet was never seriously tempted to do so, said Larry Tye, who interviewed her for his book.